The unexpected danger. The planet was quiet. The sun was low in the sky, casting a soft orange light over the vast alien landscape. It looked peaceful. The ground was covered with soft, blue grass, and the air smelled fresh, like something new and unknown. The woman, Sarah, stood at the edge of a strange forest, staring out into the vast expanse before her. Her eyes sparkled with curiosity. This was her first time exploring such an uncharted planet, and she couldn't wait to discover its secrets. She had been traveling with her team for days, scanning the planet from orbit, but now it was her turn to go down and explore. The rest of the crew had stayed behind on the ship, but Sarah was brave and eager to see what lay hidden beneath the alien sky. She stepped forward, her boots crunching softly against the alien soil. Each step was full of wonder, but also a quiet sense of unease. She had read the reports and knew that the planet had once been home to a highly advanced alien race, but now it was silent, abandoned. No one knew why. Sarah's excitement grew as she moved deeper into the alien forest, rushing past strange trees that towered over her. Their leaves glowed faintly in the low light, creating an otherworldly atmosphere. The air was thick, but not uncomfortable, as though the planet itself was alive. The trees seemed to hum, and small, glowing insects flitted about, their lights blinking like stars in the night sky. It was a beautiful place, but there was something odd about it. The quiet felt too quiet. She shook off the feeling and continued on, ignoring the sense of something watching her. The path ahead was narrow, barely wide enough for her to walk through, but she pushed forward, eager to learn more. Every corner of the forest held something new, and Sarah was determined to find it. She was so focused on the journey ahead that she didn't notice the ground beneath her feet. Then she stepped on something. A soft click echoed through the stillness, so faint that at first Sarah thought it was just the sound of her boot hitting the ground. But the air around her seemed to shift. It was as if the forest itself had stopped breathing. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and a cold shiver ran down her spine. Something was wrong. Before she could react, the ground shifted. It wasn't just a simple movement. The earth beneath her feet seemed to open up, like a massive mouth ready to swallow her whole. She froze, unable to comprehend what was happening. The trees around her rustled as though they were warning her, but it was too late. Suddenly, thick vines shot up from the ground, wrapping around her legs and arms. They were strong, impossibly strong, pulling her down into the earth with terrifying speed. Sarah screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the deepening silence of the forest. The vines tightened around her, making it hard to breathe, and she struggled to break free. Panic surged through her, and she tried to pull at the vines, but they only seemed to get tighter with each movement. The world around her spun as she was dragged further into the trap. The trees seemed to close in, their branches swaying as if they were watching her, waiting. Her heart raced, and her breath came in short, panicked gasps. What was this? A trap? A hidden danger? She had no idea, but she knew one thing. She was in serious trouble. Her mind raced as she tried to think of a way out. The vines were like iron, and they seemed to be alive, reacting to her every move. She couldn't cut them with her knife. Nothing she had would work against this. She was stuck. Her arms and legs were bound tight, and the more she struggled, the more the vines seemed to tighten. The sound of rustling leaves reached her ears, and for a moment, Sarah thought it was just her imagination. But then, there was something else. A voice, a human voice. "Hold on. I'm coming for you." Sarah's eyes snapped to the source of the voice. She could hardly believe it. There, emerging from the shadows of the trees, was a man. He was tall and strong, moving with a quiet confidence that instantly calmed Sarah's panic. He had a serious look on his face, but there was something comforting in the way he approached. He was human, just like her, but his eyes held a knowledge she couldn't explain. She tried to call up to him, but her throat was too tight with fear. The vines pulled harder, and Sarah gasped for air. The man didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, looking at the vines with the calmness of someone who had seen danger before. His eyes scanned the area quickly, assessing the situation. "Don't worry," he said. "I'll get you out." His words were simple, but they gave Sarah a strange sense of hope. She was still trapped, still in danger, but with him there, maybe, just maybe, there was a chance. But as the man moved closer, Sarah noticed something strange. The vines tightened even more. And then, the man did something she never expected. Without a second thought, he stepped into the trap. The terrifying moment. Sarah's heart raced as she struggled against the unrelenting vines. They seemed to have a mind of their own, tightening with every breath she took. She tried to scream, but the vines were choking the air from her lungs. The panic in her chest grew, making her vision blur. She had no idea what kind of trap this was, but it was unlike anything she had ever encountered. The ground felt alive, the vines shifting like serpents, their grip cold and merciless. As Sarah gasped for air, her eyes caught a flash of movement. The man, the human, was still there, standing just outside the range of the trap. He wasn't running for cover, like anyone else would have. Instead, he was calmly assessing the situation. His eyes flickered over the vines, narrowing as if he had encountered something like this before. The forest around them seemed to hold its breath, the eerie silence broken only by the sounds of the trap tightening around Sarah's body. She could barely breathe now. The pressure on her chest and limbs was overwhelming. Her thoughts were a jumbled mess of fear and disbelief. She was going to die here, alone, in this strange and hostile place. The vines were like iron, and every time she moved, they seemed to dig deeper into her skin. She was helpless. But then, something incredible happened. The man moved forward. Slowly, his eyes locked on the vines. Sarah's mind screamed at him to run, to leave before it was too late. But he didn't listen. He stepped closer, his expression unreadable, as if he had made up his mind long before stepping into this danger. "Stay still," he called to her, his voice low and calm, cutting through her rising panic. He was already within the trap's reach, moving towards her as though the danger didn't faze him. Sarah's breath hitched. Did he not understand what was happening? The vines would pull him in too. This wasn't just a simple snare, it was a death trap designed to kill. But the man didn't seem afraid. He was focused, his gaze steady as he approached her. His hands were empty. No weapons, no tools, just his bare hands, and that quiet determination. For a moment, Sarah's fear gave way to confusion. What was he thinking? Did he have a plan? Why? She tried to gasp, her voice barely audible. The man didn't answer. Instead, he moved faster, his movements fluid, like a dancer who knew exactly where to step. The vines seemed to react to him as they had to her, but he wasn't panicking. He wasn't struggling. He simply reached out, his hands brushing against the vines. And then it happened. With a loud snap, one of the vines suddenly recoiled from his touch, as if it were avoiding him. Sarah's eyes widened in disbelief. Was he not affected by the trap? The man moved in closer, working quickly but with a precision that suggested he had done this before. With each step, the vines seemed to loosen, just slightly. But the moment they did, another vine snapped toward him, trying to entangle him like it had with Sarah. He didn't flinch. Instead, he grabbed hold of it, yanking it free with a swift motion. Sarah couldn't believe what she was seeing. This wasn't just some random stranger. It was someone who knew how to fight back. Someone who had faced danger and survived. And he wasn't stopping. The vines recoiled as though they were alive, sensing a new threat. They tightened, but not as fiercely as they had before. The man wasn't giving them an inch. He pulled and twisted, using his strength to undo the trap, while Sarah just hung there, breathless, helpless to do anything but watch. Then, with a final yank, the last of the vines fell away from him. And the trap, which had been so deadly just moments before, seemed to lose its power. The vines fell limp, no longer a threat. The man stood there for a moment, chest heaving with exertion, as if he had just finished a great battle. His eyes flickered to Sarah, who was still struggling to breathe, still trapped, but now in the calm aftermath of the storm. Her eyes met his, wide with amazement. "Don't worry," he said softly, stepping forward. "You're safe now." Sarah's mind couldn't process it. Her heart was still racing, her body shaking, but there was something about this man, this human, that gave her a strange sense of peace. He hadn't just saved her from the trap. He had done something more. He had faced the danger head-on, without hesitation or fear. But just as she started to relax, a strange, quiet tension filled the air. The forest around them seemed to shift, as if the planet itself were watching, waiting for something. Sarah's instincts screamed that they were still in danger. And then she noticed something that made her heart stop. The man's hand was shaking. The unexpected hero. The vines had fallen away, leaving only the faint smell of the alien soil in the air. For a moment, everything was still. Sarah, still trapped in the remnants of the snare, could hardly believe what had just happened. The man had stepped into the trap with no hesitation, and somehow he had broken its hold on her. He didn't seem afraid, didn't flinch when the vines snapped toward him. He had simply acted. It was like he had known exactly what to do. But now, standing there, Sarah couldn't help but feel a rising question deep in her chest. Who was this man? How had he known how to defeat such a deadly trap? Her thoughts were interrupted by a low, pained grunt. She looked up to see the man stagger, his legs buckling slightly beneath him. His face was pale, his breathing shallow. Sarah's eyes widened in shock. It had happened so fast that she hadn't noticed it before, but now it was clear. He was hurt. The trap hadn't just loosened its grip on her. It had taken a toll on him as well. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice shaky. She had been so focused on her own survival that she hadn't realized he was paying the price for her freedom. He glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "I'll be fine," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. The words felt empty, as though he was trying to convince himself more than her. Sarah's stomach twisted. She could see it now. His hand was covered in blood, and the side of his shirt was torn. It was a cut that looked deep, as if the vines had grabbed him too. His breathing was uneven, and there was a tremor in his movements that hadn't been there before. Despite the pain, he stood tall. There was something about him, something unwavering. He was a stranger in this alien world, yet he had faced the trap head-on without thinking twice about the danger to himself. That was something rare, something remarkable. "Why did you do that?" Sarah asked, unable to keep the question in. It had been burning in her chest since the moment he stepped into the trap to save her. Why would he risk his life for someone he didn't even know? The man turned his gaze to her, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something in his eyes, something far more complex than the calm exterior he had shown. It was a brief flash, gone in an instant, but it was enough. "Because that's what we do," he replied quietly, his words heavy with meaning. "We protect each other, no matter what." Sarah blinked, feeling an unexpected rush of warmth flood her chest. His words were simple, but they hit harder than she could have imagined. They were more than just a statement. They were a belief, a way of life. The man's gaze softened, though his face was still tense with pain. "I know this planet better than you think," he added, as though reading the confusion on her face. "It's not the first time I've faced a trap like that." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. The realization hit her like a wave. This man, this human, wasn't just an ordinary explorer. He had been through this before. He wasn't just brave. He was experienced. Whatever he had been through on this planet, it had left its mark. And that mark had made him stronger, wiser, and unafraid. "How do you know all this?" she asked, her voice soft but full of wonder. She was beginning to understand. This man wasn't here by accident. He had a purpose. He knew this world, its dangers, and its secrets. He wasn't just saving her. He was protecting something larger than himself, and she couldn't help but feel a sense of awe for him. The man didn't answer at first. He simply took a step forward, his movements slow but purposeful. "Let's get you out of here first," he said, his voice steady again, as if the earlier pain had been forgotten. "You're not safe yet." Sarah nodded, though part of her still had questions. But for now, she knew she needed to trust him. She had no choice. Her mind couldn't process everything that had just happened. One minute, she was fighting for her life, and the next, this stranger had come out of nowhere, risking everything to save her. As they moved away from the trap, Sarah glanced back at the remnants of the snare. The ground was still shifting, the trees swaying gently, as though the planet itself had witnessed their struggle. It felt as though the world was watching them, silently judging what had just occurred. But Sarah didn't care about that anymore. She had a new understanding. This man was no ordinary person. He was a protector, a warrior perhaps, and she was going to have to rely on him if they were going to make it out alive. They walked in silence for a few moments, the weight of the encounter settling between them. Sarah could feel the tension in the air, but she also felt a new sense of hope. This stranger, this human, wasn't just anyone. He was the hero she hadn't known she needed, and with him by her side, she felt like maybe, just maybe, they could survive whatever else this alien planet threw at them. The risky rescue. The planet's eerie silence stretched out around them as Sarah and the man made their way deeper into the alien wilderness. The danger of the trap was still fresh in Sarah's mind, but there was something more pressing now, something gnawing at her instinct, something she couldn't ignore. They had barely covered any ground when Sarah noticed it. The air had shifted. It was heavier, thicker somehow, and the trees that had seemed so peaceful earlier now looked more like towering sentinels, their twisted branches reaching out like fingers, watching them. The glow from the leaves had dimmed, casting an unsettling twilight across the landscape. A faint hum resonated from somewhere deep within the forest, and Sarah's senses screamed that they were not alone. She glanced at the man. He was still walking beside her, but his posture had changed. He wasn't just moving to move anymore. He was listening, watching, anticipating. His steps were measured, his eyes darting around the surroundings. His earlier calm had turned into something more intense, more alert. Sarah's stomach twisted with an unsettling feeling. The worst wasn't over. In fact, it was only just beginning. "Stay close," the man said, his voice low but firm. The command was simple, but Sarah knew that he wasn't just speaking to her. He was speaking to the forest, and the forest was listening. Suddenly, the sound of rustling leaves erupted from behind them, and before Sarah could even react, the man spun around, pulling her down to the ground. The movement was quick, controlled, instinctive. She barely had time to process what was happening when she saw it. A creature, no larger than a wolf, but with glowing red eyes and razor-sharp claws, burst out of the underbrush. Its jaws snapped shut, missing the man by mere inches. The man didn't hesitate. His hand shot to his waist, pulling out a sharp metallic object Sarah hadn't seen before. It glinted in the dim light of the alien forest. He didn't give the creature a second to think. With lightning speed, he lunged forward, slashing at the creature's face, leaving a deep, sizzling gash in its skin. The beast screeched in pain, but it didn't retreat. It charged again, faster than before, its claws aimed directly at the man. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She had never seen anything like this before. The alien world they had landed on was full of mysteries. But this was a nightmare come to life. The man, however, didn't falter. He was already moving again, stepping in front of her to shield her from the oncoming attack. The beast's claws scraped against his armor, but the man didn't even flinch. He was protecting her. For a split second, Sarah didn't know what to do. She was frozen, terrified. The creature's glowing eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment, she thought it would strike. But before she could react, the man stepped in again, his weapon flashing as he slashed at the creature's side. This time, the beast stumbled back, its growls turning to whimpers. Sarah's heart raced and instinct took over. She grabbed the nearest object she could find, a large rock, and hurled it at the creature. The impact distracted it just long enough for the man to step forward again. With one swift motion, he drove his weapon into the creature's chest. It let out a final screech before collapsing to the ground, its glowing eyes dimming. The forest fell silent once again. Sarah breathed heavily, her body still frozen from the adrenaline rush. The man stood over the creature, his chest rising and falling with effort. He was covered in dirt and sweat, and the deep cut on his side from earlier seemed to have worsened. Blood stained his shirt, but he didn't seem to notice. His eyes were scanning the area, looking for any more threats. "We need to move now," he said, his voice cold but steady. There was no time for relief, no time to process what had just happened. The danger wasn't over, not by a long shot. Sarah's mind was racing. She had just witnessed a fight for survival, something she had never thought she'd experience. This man had protected her, risked his life for her, even though he had no reason to. She had seen how he had stepped into the trap for her without thinking. And now she was seeing it again. His courage, his willingness to put himself in danger, no matter the cost. "Why are you doing this?" she asked again, her voice barely a whisper. She could barely catch her breath after the fight. And yet the question burned in her chest. The man didn't answer right away. He didn't have to. He simply looked at her, his eyes dark but filled with something deeper, something that went beyond duty, something that spoke of a past full of struggles and choices. His silence was an answer in itself. He wasn't just a hero by chance. He had chosen to be one. The moment stretched on for a long beat, but the man finally spoke. "We don't leave anyone behind. Not now. Not ever." His words were simple, but they held a weight that Sarah could feel in her bones. She was no longer just a survivor. She was part of something bigger, something worth fighting for. The sacrifice. The silence after the battle with the creature felt strange. The forest, which had once seemed alive with soft whispers and gentle hums, now felt oppressive. The air was heavy with the lingering scent of the alien beast's blood, and Sarah's heartbeat was the only sound she could focus on. But there was something more pressing in the stillness. The man. He had stood strong during the fight, moving with the fluid grace of someone who had faced countless dangers before. But now, as they trudged through the forest, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The way he moved wasn't as steady as before. The way his breath came in short gasps. There was something in his eyes, something behind that steely gaze, that told her he wasn't okay. They walked in silence for a few moments, but Sarah's mind raced with worry. The cut on his side, the blood that had stained his clothes earlier, it was worse now. The man's face was pale, and his movements were slower, more labored. He tried to hide it, but Sarah could see it clearly. Every step he took seemed heavier than the last. She couldn't ignore it any longer. "You're hurt," she said, her voice quiet but urgent. "We need to stop. You need help." The man didn't respond right away. His jaw clenched as he continued to walk, his eyes scanning their surroundings. He was trying to push through it, trying to appear unaffected, but Sarah wasn't fooled. She could see the way his hand trembled when he reached up to touch the wound on his side. The blood was soaking through his shirt now, staining his hands. "I'm fine," he finally said, his voice hoarse. "We don't have time to stop. We're not safe yet." Sarah could hear the determination in his voice, but it didn't make her feel better. It only made the fear in her chest grow. This wasn't just a minor injury. The blood loss alone would slow him down, and the pain was already taking its toll on his stamina. She had no idea how much longer he could keep pushing forward. But the more she looked at him, the more she understood. He wasn't going to stop. Not for anything. Not for her. And certainly not for himself. This man wasn't here to make sure he survived. He was here to make sure she did. The weight of that realization sank in like a stone. They walked in silence again. But this time, Sarah's mind was a whirlpool of conflicting thoughts. Should she try to make him stop? Should she insist on helping him? Or should she keep moving, knowing that staying in one place could cost them both their lives? Every instinct in her screamed to help him, to do whatever she could to ease his suffering. But another part of her, the part that had been forged in the last few days of peril, knew that if they didn't keep moving, they were as good as dead. Her eyes flickered back to the man. His expression was unreadable, his face set in a mask of stoic determination. But the faint tremor in his hands, the deep lines of exhaustion beneath his eyes, told a different story. He wasn't fine. He was breaking. And yet, he still didn't stop. "Please," she whispered, almost to herself. "You don't have to do this alone." The words hung in the air between them, but the man didn't respond. He couldn't. He was too focused on the path ahead. But Sarah could see it now. This wasn't just about survival. It wasn't about finding a way out of this alien jungle. It was about something deeper, something personal. The sacrifice wasn't just physical. It was something more profound. And it was all for her. They moved through the forest, the shadows growing longer with each passing minute, and Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. Every rustle in the trees made her jump. Every whisper of wind felt like a threat. But the man kept moving forward, pushing through the pain, determined to protect her at any cost. He wasn't just a stranger anymore. He was the reason she was still alive, the reason she hadn't given up. She wanted to say something more, to beg him to stop, to let her help him. But the words died in her throat. She knew he wouldn't listen. He had made his choice. He had decided that his pain didn't matter. That she did. Suddenly, the man staggered, his breath coming in sharp gasps. He didn't collapse, but he faltered just long enough for Sarah to notice. He had pushed himself too far. The blood loss, the strain of the fight, it was all catching up with him now. His face twisted in pain, and for the first time, he let his guard slip. His eyes met hers, and there was a flicker of something vulnerable, that he had been hiding all this time. "I'm not going to make it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The words hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. Her eyes widened, and for the first time since meeting him, she saw the true weight of what he had done. The pain wasn't just physical. It was a sacrifice he had made willingly. He wasn't just trying to survive. He was making sure she survived. "Don't say that," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "You can't just give up." But the man only gave her a small, pained smile. "I've never been one to give up," he said softly. "But sometimes, survival isn't just about keeping yourself alive." Sarah's heart clenched. She wanted to protest, to scream at him to keep fighting. But she knew, deep down, that he wasn't talking about physical survival anymore. He had already made his choice. And in doing so, he had changed everything. The escape. The forest seemed to close in around them, as though it were alive, watching them as they struggled through it. The sky above had darkened, casting long shadows that twisted like fingers on the ground. Sarah could feel the weight of each step she took, not just because of the exhausting terrain, but because of the man's condition. His breathing was shallow, each step slower than the last. He was running on fumes now, barely keeping himself upright, and Sarah's heart ached with every staggered movement. They had to move. The danger wasn't just in the trees anymore. The sounds of the jungle, the unsettling rustling, the far-off growls were closing in. They were too exposed here. They needed shelter, somewhere to rest, somewhere to think. But every time Sarah tried to suggest stopping, the man's eyes hardened and his voice became firm. "We keep moving. We don't stop until we find cover." It wasn't an order. It was a promise. But it wasn't a promise he could keep alone. Sarah knew that now. She glanced over at him, the darkness around them making his face appear even more worn. His eyes were distant, filled with a quiet resolve, but there was no mistaking the toll the journey had taken on him. He had protected her, fought for her, endured more pain than anyone should have to, and now his body was finally giving out. And still, he pushed forward. She couldn't bear it any longer. Something inside her snapped. She wasn't just a passenger anymore. She couldn't let him do this alone. He had already sacrificed too much, and she had to repay him in some way. "Stop," she said firmly, her voice breaking through the noise in her mind. She stepped in front of him, blocking his path. "We need to stop. You're not going to make it if you keep going like this." He looked at her, his eyes flickering with the same quiet determination he always had. But for the first time, there was a crack in the facade. His shoulders slumped, and the weight of exhaustion seemed to flood him. His eyes softened, and for a moment, he looked like just a man, vulnerable and tired, like anyone else. The walls he had built around himself fell away, if only for a second. I can't keep going like this," he admitted, his voice hoarse, barely audible. The words were a release, a confession of defeat, and yet even in his weakness, there was something incredibly powerful about it. For the first time, he was letting her in, showing her the price of his sacrifice. He wasn't invincible. He was human. Sarah didn't waste a second. Without thinking, she reached out, gently supporting his weight as his legs threatened to give way. She knew they couldn't keep moving without help. He needed rest. She couldn't let him fall now, not after everything he had done for her. "You don't have to do this alone anymore," she whispered, guiding him toward a cluster of large moss-covered rocks. They looked like they could provide some shelter from the eyes that might be watching them, some protection from whatever else this planet had in store. "I'm not leaving you behind. We're in this together." The man didn't say anything at first, his eyes scanning their surroundings warily. But there was a quiet gratitude in the way he allowed her to lead him. He wasn't resisting anymore. He was too exhausted to fight, too far gone to pretend he could do this on his own. For the first time, he let someone else take the lead. As they settled against the rocks, the weight of the moment settled on Sarah's shoulders. She could feel the tension between them, the unspoken bond that had formed in the face of danger. The man had fought for her. He had bled for her. And now, in this small moment of peace, she could see the true cost of that sacrifice. She could see the price he had paid to make sure she lived. She gently pressed her fingers against his side, where the wound had been, now darkened with blood. The sight made her stomach turn, but she pushed the nausea away. She wasn't going to let him die here, not when she had a chance to help. The man leaned back against the rocks, closing his eyes for a moment. It wasn't sleep, but rather a brief moment of respite. The pain was still there, gnawing at him, but for a few seconds, he was allowed to breathe. "Why?" Sarah whispered, looking down at him. "Why did you do this? Why did you risk everything for me?" His eyes flickered open, meeting hers with an expression that was far too weary to be filled with anything other than truth. He let out a quiet sigh. "Because," he said, his voice almost too soft to hear, "because you're worth it. No matter what. You don't leave someone behind when they need you." Sarah's heart twisted. She wanted to say more, but the words felt inadequate. How could she explain what she felt? How could she express the gratitude, the awe, the overwhelming respect she had for him in that one simple sentence? "I won't leave you behind," she said firmly, her voice steady. The man nodded slowly, his eyes drifting closed again. A small, almost imperceptible smile tugged at the corner of his lips. They sat in silence for a while, the sound of the distant jungle slowly fading as the night settled in. They were safe for now, but Sarah knew that the real battle wasn't over. The forest, the creatures, the traps, it was all just the beginning. But with the man beside her, she felt a strange sense of hope. They weren't alone anymore. They had each other. And that, for the first time since she had landed on this strange world, felt like enough. The power of humanity. The forest was still, the night thick with the weight of their struggle. Sarah sat beside the man, watching the stars twinkle in the strange alien sky above them. They had found a temporary refuge in the rocky outcrop, the cold stone a reminder that they weren't alone in this world. The quiet hum of the jungle creatures and the soft wind were the only sounds that filled the silence between them. But despite the calm, Sarah couldn't shake the storm of thoughts swirling in her mind. They had survived so much, but how much longer could they keep running? The man's wounds were still there, still bleeding, though the immediate danger had passed. She had patched him up as best as she could, but the reality remained. He was fading. The pain was taking its toll, and she wasn't sure how much longer he could hold on. And yet, he was still here, still fighting, still choosing to protect her. She couldn't stop the question from rising in her chest, a question that had been building since the moment they first encountered danger. Why? Why had he risked everything for her when he didn't even know who she was? Why had he fought so fiercely, pushed through pain and exhaustion, just to ensure she stayed alive? The stars above seemed distant, their light cold and indifferent. But in that moment, Sarah felt a deeper understanding. It wasn't the stars or the planet that defined their survival. It wasn't the strange creatures or the traps that threatened them. It was something far stronger. It was the human spirit, the human heart. The man, with all his strength and determination, had shown her something that transcended the alien world around them. It wasn't about survival alone. It was about connection, about what it meant to protect someone, even when it meant sacrificing yourself. He had given everything for her, without hesitation, without question. She turned to him, her voice softer than before, but filled with all the emotion she had been holding back. "Why did you do it?" she asked, the words barely above a whisper. "Why did you risk so much for me?" For a long moment, the man didn't respond. His eyes were closed, his face pale, but there was something in the way he held himself that made Sarah believe he wasn't just waiting for an answer. He was remembering. He was reliving the reasons that had driven him, that had made him who he was. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, and there was a weariness in it that spoke of more than just physical exhaustion. "Because," he started, his words coming slow, deliberate, as though he were searching for the right way to explain it. "Because I believe that we're meant to help each other. No one should have to face the darkness alone." Sarah felt a pang in her chest at the weight of his words. There was no grand speech, no sweeping declaration of heroism. It was simple, honest, true. He wasn't just talking about survival. He wasn't just talking about fighting against the alien threats they faced. He was talking about something deeper, the bond that connects all people. The trust. The belief that, no matter what, we are not meant to stand alone in this world. That there is something powerful in the way we protect each other. Something that goes beyond strength and weapons. "We're all we've got out here," he continued, his eyes opening slowly, meeting hers with a quiet intensity. "The galaxy is big. The dangers are real. But it's the people we meet, the bonds we form, that matter. That's what makes us human." Sarah swallowed hard, the realization settling deep in her bones. She had seen what he was willing to do for her, how he had faced every obstacle, every pain without question. It wasn't just bravery. It was selflessness. It was love for another person, even in the darkest of times. She had always heard stories of heroes, of warriors who would fight for a cause, who would sacrifice themselves for the greater good. But this was different. This was about choosing to fight for someone else, even when there was no promise of victory. It was about doing the right thing, not because it would lead to glory, but because it was simply what had to be done. Sarah's eyes welled with tears as she looked at him. He was so much more than a stranger now. He was the embodiment of everything humanity stood for: resilience, hope, and an unwavering belief in the goodness of people, no matter the odds. "You've already saved me," she said, her voice trembling. "But I promise, I won't let you down. I won't leave you behind." The man smiled faintly, a hint of relief in his eyes. "I never thought you would." In that moment, the weight of everything they had been through, the traps, the dangers, the sacrifices, seemed to lift, if only for a heartbeat. They weren't just survivors of this planet anymore. They were something more. They were a testament to what it meant to fight for each other, to protect each other, even in the face of impossible odds. Sarah helped him to his feet, supporting him as he stood tall, even though he was still weak. But she knew they weren't done yet. There was more ahead of them, more dangers, more obstacles. But for the first time since they had landed, she felt a sense of certainty. They were not alone. Not anymore. Together, they would find a way to survive. Together, they would face whatever the galaxy threw at them. And together, they would be more than just two people trying to stay alive. They would be a story of humanity's greatest strength, the ability to fight for each other, no matter what.